All right, everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started. So thanks for joining us to kick off this last day of DrupalCon Barcelona. Everybody having a great time here? Come on. We can do better than that. Everybody having a great time? It's better. We need more coffee, I think. We need more coffee.
It's early. There's no coffee.
Right. All of that. All right. So today we're going to talk about the recipes initiative, which I like to think of as the meat of Drupal CMS. But of course, we're a little biased. So for anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Martin Anderson Klutz. I am a senior solutions engineer at Acquia. I'm also on the Talking Drupal podcast, and earlier this year I was named as the track lead for the events recipe track of Drupal Starshot, aka Drupal CMS. And you can reach me on all of the Drupal and social channels as ManGlue.
I'm Mark Casillas. I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I am a senior Drupal developer at Lullabot. This is a fresh thing for me, so I just started with them. I am on the community health team, the community working group with the conflict resolution team. I maintain the smart trim module, and I do shenanigans as much as possible. You can reach me on all the Drupal stuff at Markie, but not the website Markie, Markie. That's somebody else, and I'm really jealous of that domain name. So what we're going to be talking about today is we've got a bit of an agenda, why we're going to do recipes, why recipes are. The big news of recipes, what's been going on during the initiative. We're going to show the anatomy of a recipe and how to apply recipes, and then what we're going to be working on in the future, and then we got a live demo because those are always fun to watch. So the first question is, why are we doing recipes? Mainly, there was a big problem with distributions and install profiles. They tend to get you stuck into what they're doing. If you're the person that upgrades the installation or distribution doesn't upgrade something, you can't upgrade it because it's a requirement. You can't remove it. You can't mix and match anything. You're pretty much stuck in this one thing. Anybody that's been stuck in a media type that they didn't want and wanted to get rid of it, but they can't because of an installation profile, understand what I'm talking about. And also, they're very hard to find. They're not really well maintained or well promoted on the Drupal.org website anymore, or not that they ever were, really. So we came up with the solution of recipes, a really lightweight, quick way to add a bunch of different things into your site. There were some Drush solutions that used to be happening. You can install modules, but you do not have to code any of them or configure them. They actually do the button pushing, so you can configure. They're composable from other Drupal recipes, so you can mix and match however you want them to go. They're applied to Drupal sites, not installed, which means that once you use them, you're done with them, and off you go. And they don't lock in your site. And then finally, they're easy to share because they're a real quick file going down. The next part is the big news of what we've been doing. Phase 1 of the roadmap is complete, which means that we have put this into Drupal core as an experimental API as far as 10.3 and 11. The phase goal was the ability just basically to make sure that it works and that we're able to work on it. So now we're on to phase 2. The phase 1 roadmap was recipes class to read the recipes YAML file, which it works with, and then also that you can put it in the composer JSON file. Enable recipes to apply other recipes prior to the ones that have been applied to themselves. Create the recipe runner, which is really fun to do, to process Drupal recipes files, and install a list of extensions, and then without their configuration entities, and then also use their configuration entities. The configuration action APIs came in later, extending the runners and all these different things. So, I hate reading slides, so I get bored with it and I start skipping around, and then I get lost. So anyway, roadmap has been phase 1 has been complete, which is great because we could not have to talk about it anymore. So if we're looking at the past of what we were doing with recipes, this all started in DrupalCon Portland, where we started talking about the initiative. In Prague, Alex Block demonstrates the proof of concept in Prague 2020, which was in, I think, about August. It was in August. September-ish, about this time. Here we are. So the config actions APIs was added between 22 and 24. And then validation is introduced, which is allowing us to roll back a recipe if it doesn't work the way that we want, which is very important because if something doesn't work, you got to be able to get out of it, in my mind. In 2024, also, we've worked out, after months of work in QA by many contributors, the standard Drupal profile recipe is created, which basically pulls the standard profile into a recipe so that you're actually using recipe to install Drupal out of the gate. Then phase 1 was completed, and then we're working on minimal and Unami profiles being converted into recipes as well. I believe, how far are those? Those are pretty much done, yeah?
I think they're pretty much.
Yeah. And then Drupal 11 is released, and Drupal 10.3 is released with the actual API in there as experimental. So your mileage may vary.
All right, so let's talk about what goes into a recipe. What is the anatomy of a recipe? So a recipe is sort of put into a directory similar to what you would see with other kinds of projects like a module. The key one really being this new recipe.yaml file. In some ways, very similar to what you might be used to seeing in like an info.yaml in like a theme or a module. Within there, you can define things like what other recipes you want your recipe to apply. You can say, are there particular projects, so like modules or themes that you want your recipe to install? Of those existing contrib projects, are there some of their configuration that you want to make sure gets installed? You can also run config actions. So those are sort of like the key sections of your recipe.yaml. Also, again, similar to other kinds of projects, you're going to have your composer.json where you're going to declare the different dependencies that should be pulled into your, overall code base. And then you have these optional folders for configuration that you want to have imported or content that you want to have created. So here's an example of an actual recipe that's on Drupal.org today. So alerts. And so you can see here we have that composer.json and the recipe.yaml. We have a variety of different configuration that will get imported when you apply this recipe. And then there is a content folder, and then nested within there is a taxonomy term. So within the content folder, there are subdirectories that are keyed by the entity ID of the entities that you want created. And in this case, it's going to create 3 different taxonomy terms. So let's talk about the composer.json to start. So again, fairly similar to what you would see in terms of defining your different dependencies. Probably the critical difference here is the type, so this being a Drupal recipe. But then otherwise, you're sort of defining your requirements. So these can be other recipes, they can be specific modules or themes. And then you can also optionally put in this suggest key. Today, that doesn't necessarily do a whole lot. So somebody running or applying a recipe on the command line, or requiring it via Composer, we'll see at the end sort of things that you put in here via suggestions, but in time maybe we'll be able to do a little bit more with that. Now, when we get into the recipe.yaml, again, to start, it's going to look pretty similar to what you're used to in your info.yaml for other kinds of projects today, so name, description, and type. But already we can start to see some differences. So here's where you can say which other recipes you want to have applied at the start of your recipe being applied. Again, this is optional. Then you can define other kinds of projects. So in this case, the example that we're seeing on the screen shows a couple of different paragraphs related modules that should be installed as part of this recipe being applied. And then we can say, is there configuration from those that we want to make sure gets imported? So by default, when you include different projects as part of that install key, it's only going to pull through basic configurations. So think of like settings, or maybe thinking about it another way, excluding any configuration entities that would be part of that project's normal configuration that gets imported. And so that's where you can use this config import to say, in this case, we've got one example showing pull in everything configuration-wise that one applies, or we can say maybe there are specific entities that we want to make sure get imported. So you have flexibility as sort of the recipe author to decide which way you want to go with that. Then the next part is really config actions, and we said at the start that I like to think of recipes as kind of like the meat of Drupal CMS. Config actions is like the secret sauce that gives it all of the awesomeness that I think recipes really brings to Drupal. So config actions is sort of the last section of your recipe.yaml. And it's really a flexible way of being able to apply configuration to your site. So within the actions key here, you can see that the first piece is where you say what's the actual configuration ID that you want to apply to. The next piece is what's the actual action that you want to take. So in the example that we see here, it's simple config update. And then from there, you apply sort of the actual configuration that you want applied to the site. So in this case, saying, set the system theme to this emulsify theme as the example here. Some of the actions will have different forms, whether they're singular or plural. Some of them will take, more or fewer arguments, but we'll get into those specifics in a moment. It's worth noting that the config actions is actually also an API, so you can see here that it's actually using PHP attributes as opposed to sort of the older doc block style notation. And what that means is, importantly, you can define your own config actions. So if there are very particular ways that you need recipes that are custom to what you need to do, you can create your own config actions and then use those within your recipes. But recipes can't contain any PHP code, so you would have to have those in sort of like a separate module and then make sure that's required by your recipe. Within the config actions, you can have ones. Actually, let me just go back and point out one thing. So there is a key within the config action declaration where you can say entity types. So if you leave that empty or omit it, that means that that config action can be used on any kind of entity type. But if you do pass in some values here, so in this case user role, that means that in this case the config action that we're seeing here could only be used on user roles. And so that's sort of a fundamental difference between different kinds of config actions. And so let's start by talking about some config actions that are sort of globally available in terms of being able to be applied to any kind of configuration entity. So simple config update, we saw in the example just now. Create if not exists is one that you'll see probably in a lot of recipes that are already in the ecosystem, very useful for things where you want to say, maybe there's a particular content type that you want to create, but if there's already a content type that has that same ID, then sort of do nothing and assume that everything is okay. You can also set particular components. You can create values. There's set third-party settings, and actually the QR code here goes to a documentation page that actually has a couple more examples of these kinds of globally applicable entity actions. Now, there are some that are also very specific, as we saw, to individual kinds of configuration entities. So if you're dealing with roles, you can use the grant permissions config action to say, for, let's say, our content editors, we want to make sure that they get these specific permissions that are, specific to our individual recipe. If you're working with workflows, you can add content types or vocabularies using these different kinds of config actions. In the same way, there are ones for fields or CK editor toolbars. But if you go to this page, which is a different documentation page, I think there's like 12 other ones. So there's, probably a growing list of these config actions, as we identify the needs for different kinds of things that recipes need to be able to do. You can also use wildcards for some of these. So rather than having to declare, each, let's say, content type or role that we want to add a specific permission, we can use these wildcards to say, for all existing roles on this website, grant them this permission because we want to make sure that they're all able to do this new thing. So using these wildcards, again, becomes a very flexible way to update your site's configuration without having to sort of individually declare all of the different places. And also it means that you can use them and make them as useful as possible in places where you can't even anticipate, what are all of the content types to which some of these things need to be applied. Some best practices around creating recipes. There is this concept called item potency, which is a word that until recently I had never heard. But basically, it's the idea that recipes are something that you should be able to reapply again and again to your site without it throwing some kind of an error. And so the tricky part there is that's where the value of config actions comes in terms of being able to use things like the create if not exists, so that the overall recipe can be flexible enough to deal with different kinds of initial situations in terms of what it might encounter. There is a sense that recipes are best if they're kept fairly granular. So Mark talked earlier about how things like the standard profile are now based on recipes. And if you actually look at how those are constructed, it's kind of a recipe of recipes. And so there's very granular recipes within there. And that's notionally the best way to sort of create those recipes. From a maintenance standpoint, it becomes much easier to maintain those individual pieces as opposed to sort of like one monolithic recipe that has 50 different items of config to apply. And then, by all means, publish and share these. We're going to share a little bit later. There's a cookbook already. It's a wiki page. So if you're creating recipes, by all means, share those with the community, and let's have some fruitful dialogue around, what are some best practices and what are some of the exciting ways that we can use recipes. So if you wanted to go ahead and create your recipe, I would say today it's a fairly manual process. When I've constructed recipes, the process that I've tended to follow is have some kind of like a local development site where I'll build out the capabilities that I want, do some kind of like a Drush configuration export, cherry pick the individual config files that I think I'm going to need, write that recipe.yaml file, create the composer.json file, bring all of that into a fresh site, and then start, iterating. So I'll probably apply the recipe. It'll throw an error that it's missing something. I'll pull that in and sort of keep going until it applies cleanly. And then once I get it to apply cleanly, then make sure that I reapply it so that the item potency is working as intended. And again, adjusting, moving some things over to config actions as needed. There are some things that you can do to sort of help ease the process of creating a recipe. There is a recipe generator that Kevin Quillen created last year. I think it's more focused on helping you to easily create the dependencies for things like your recipe.yaml and your composer.json. As far as I know, it doesn't necessarily actually pull together the config files. There is an issue for the features module to potentially use that as an engine for helping to collect together the config. As I understand it, features today already does a lot of a similar kind of thing in terms of creating modules that pull together the configuration and importantly anticipates all of the dependencies. So I feel like it's potentially a short leap to be able to use that capability of features as a really powerful way to help make it easier to create recipes. And then also I heard recently from a colleague who has been working on a VS Code extension for autocomplete of different kinds of config actions for writing, again, your recipe.yaml file. So that is something that apparently is available today in the VS Code marketplace. By all means, try that out. Provide feedback where you can because it is very much sort of a new living, breathing thing. We also mentioned before that recipes can contain content. So the recipe system today includes the import part of what is the default content contrib project. And so importantly, what that means is that if we have YAML files as part of a recipe, like we saw in the alerts example earlier, when you apply that recipe, it will actually go through and create those individual entities. If you want to create those entities, create the YAML file for those entities. Really, probably the best practice today is actually to use the default content contrib module as the way to generate those, and it will actually do the work for you of putting those into the subdirectories based on the entity ID. And so the idea being that you can use default content, tell it which actual content entities you want exported, and then sort of take the structure that it gives you and put that directly into the content directory of your recipe. So here's another example of an existing recipe. I thought this one was good because it actually demonstrates a few of these other concepts that we've talked about. So within the recipe.yaml here, we can see that it's installing a combination of core and contrib projects. It's actually defining a variety of different configuration that it wants to make sure gets imported as part of those projects being installed. And now it's using a variety of different config actions using things like create if not exists, setting components to sort of set up some of the different form layout, and so on. So that's sort of a very quick look at the sort of structure of a recipe.yaml at a bit of a deeper level. But let's also talk quickly about the process of applying a recipe. So today, there is some support for recipes in the project browser, as we saw in the Driesnote example earlier in the week. But for myself, when I'm applying recipes, particularly ones from more the contrib space, I'm usually doing that today on the command line. So there are sort of like PHP script ways to do it. There is this ddev command, but if you're using Drush 13, you can use Drush recipe, and for me, that is by far the easiest way to do that. It is also important to understand the order in which the recipe runner will go through those different tasks. So it'll start by applying any other recipes that you call for in your recipe.yaml. From there, it will go to install the modules and themes. And remember, it will import basic configuration, but nothing else unless you specifically say. So then the next step, it will go through and import any additional configuration that you specify for those projects. Then it will go through and import any configuration that you provide as part of that configuration subdirectory. It will then apply any configuration actions, and as the last step, it will import any of the content that your recipe provides. So we did talk earlier about core install profiles now being converted over to recipes. Again, I think the important idea here is that when you're creating your own recipes, you can actually use some of those more granular sub-recipes. Well, maybe sub-recipes is a bit controversial, but the individual recipes that make up that larger sort of install profile recipe, you can use those as part of your own recipe. So if you wanted to make your own sort of like custom install profile, by all means leverage those existing ones that core has defined, because that's, I would say really a best practice, because those will definitely be well maintained over time. And so it frees your team up of sort of the technical debt of reproducing some of those.
A really good recipe always starts with boiling potatoes. So that's a recipe that you use with other recipes, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, especially in Spain, where hopefully everybody's tried the potatoes bravas. All right, the CLI of installing using recipes, here's an example of doing that on the command line, but again, using the UI today, when you install Drupal, you're also using recipes. Here is some examples of some of the smaller recipes that make up in the sort of standard install profile, and again, these are all different things that you can use as part of your own recipes if you want to do something more custom as a starting point as well. Umami was also converted over into an install profile, into a set of recipes. These are probably sort of less useful in terms of doing something more custom, because they are fairly opinionated in terms of the kind of experience that they're meant to create. But again, if you're creating your own sort of custom recipe as a starting point for site creation, by all means go ahead and leverage those more granular recipes that are part of core as I would say an overall best practice. Some of the things that we're working on in terms of that phase 2 that Mark talked about. Unpacking recipes is definitely an important step. So today you can composer require a recipe. It'll bring in all of those dependencies. You can apply the recipe, and notionally you should be able to sort of remove that recipe entirely from your site. But today, if you were to sort of composer remove that, then it would also mean you lose all of those different dependencies. And so the idea of unpacking is that you should be able to have the dependencies of anything that was explicitly required by your recipe essentially added to the site's composer.json, so that you could actually composer remove that recipe that you had applied, but still you would have all of those dependencies, which is important because if you've now added to your site configuration that depends on those different dependencies, then removing those would leave your site in a less than functional state. Config validation is something that I think is actually pretty close to being completed. So in some of the early work of working on recipes, there were times where it could start going through the process of applying a recipe to your site, realize that there's some kind of a missing dependency or something like that, and then it would actually sort of just halt and leave your site in sort of this semi-applied state, whereas now it'll go through, fully validate the config and make sure that all of the dependencies are in place before it actually applies the recipe. And so what that means is it's almost like applying the configuration to almost like a temporary version of your site. Once all of that is validated, only then it'll switch over so that you never have to worry about a recipe kind of breaking your site in the process of being applied. I think some of the things that we're working on are making sure that there's maybe the right balance of flexibility. So if there are things like, empty quotes versus null values or some of those kinds of things, that those are sort of considered equivalent from a validation standpoint. We already talked about how you can use things like wildcards to make your config actions a little bit more dynamic. But there is this idea of potentially using things like placeholders so that where permissions are meant to include things like the name of the bundle that they apply to, that you could use that as like a placeholder. Again, the idea being that you shouldn't have to sort of manually declare these for each of the different bundles or different things that you need to apply them to. Some of the other things for the phase 2 roadmap, so making sure that there is some kind of a fully functioning UI. So again, probably a lot of this work is going to be in the project browser. We already talked about unpacking as sort of a critical piece, making sure that discovery, so again, project browser probably being key. There's already some good discussion around what's a good way to be able to test recipes. So, from a development standpoint, to make sure that they're not going to be breaking or having regressions over time, making sure that the recipe runner will always apply them sequentially as opposed to in parallel. And then there is already in core the ability to have recipes prompt for user input. So let's say your recipe required an API key or some kind of a password to be able to work properly out of the box. Instead of applying the recipe and then trusting that the user will know where to go in the UI to make sure that API key is put into the configuration. You can prompt them for that up front, and then that way, once the recipe is applied, the functionality is good to go. There is also, coming in Drupal 11.1, some config actions to be able to place blocks. And one of the things that I'm excited about with these is the flexibility that they give you. So today you could place blocks as part of a recipe, but you would have to explicitly declare, what's the theme that it's going to be applied to, what's the name of the region that it's going to go into, and then what is the numerical weight that it's going to be assigned. And that means that it's probably for a lot of sites not necessarily going to be applied in a useful way. So you could say every site is probably going to have the Olivero theme, but if it's not the active theme, then running that recipe to place a block in Olivero may not be super useful. So using these new themes, you could do something like, say, place a block in the default theme, and it'll figure out what is the active theme on the site and make sure that it's applied. You can provide an array of different regions, and you can also provide sort of a fallback region. So you might say something like, try one of these different regions, but if none of those are found, then place it in the content region, which probably every site or every theme is going to have. And then instead of providing sort of a numerical weight, you can say position this first in the region or position this last, and it'll actually do the work of figuring out what's the numerical weight that it needs to be assigned to be able to sort of achieve the intended effect. So a lot of flexibility there. I'm hoping some of these same kinds of flexibilities we'll start to have in terms of like adding fields to forms or display, some of those kinds of things over time as well. There's also a lot of work that's already been going on in terms of documentation of recipes. So as we've gone through, you've probably noticed those QR codes. They are also linked in the notes, and we'll make these available afterwards. A lot of those link to existing documentation pages, but there is already the sense that the documentation should really live outside of the recipes initiative project and really be part of more the core Drupal.org documentation system. So definitely help is needed both in terms of the ongoing upkeep of the documentation, but also that larger set of work around making sure that that's available in the best possible place for people who are working on recipes. There is also this recipes cookbook. Again, there's a QR code here for anybody who wants to go check it out. It is a wiki page, so if you create your own recipes, by all means go in there and make sure that they're added. But also, if you just want to sort of kick the tires, apply some recipes maybe to a fresh local install, this is a great place to see what some of your options are available in terms of where to get started. So with that, let's actually get our hands
Live
dirty.
demo time.
Live demo time, always exciting. All right, so here is a fresh copy of Drupal 11. I did make a few changes, like enabling the experimental navigation module. I've got the gin theme installed and a couple of sort of small extras. But critically, if we look at the content architecture, we have only the default article and basic page. Actually, let's just move that up a little so it's easier to see. And of course, now it decides it wants to update. So let's go ahead.
No, let's go and update iTunes.
That's right. So let's go ahead and apply our first recipe. So we'll go tdev drush.
Yeah, I was going to say, could you increase the... In iTerm, it's a pain to do as well.
Is that a little better? I could probably make it a little better. Yeah. There we go. All right, so ddev drush recipe will go recipes as of Drupal 11 live outside of the document root. And then we'll go events. And just like that. Oh, the other thing, today, when you apply a recipe on the command line, I find it's usually helpful to also rebuild your cache so that particularly
Keep calm and
ads,
clear your cache.
right? When in doubt, clear the cache. So now we can see we have this event system. Again, some of this will look familiar from what we saw in the Driesnote earlier in the week. Now we can go ahead and add an event. And we have all of our content here. So let's just call this our test event. We'll set it to be some point in the future, 10 a.m. We can change the duration, all those good things. Go ahead and save that. And now we can see it's listed in there. If we go in, we can also see that we have our add calendar links. So all of that in just a few seconds on the command line. But wait, there's more. Let's go ahead and add some more recipes. So let's go ahead and say we want to add the events calendar like we saw. One thing I'll point out, as I run some of these other events recipes, it's actually reapplying the original events recipe. So we're actually seeing in action the item potency that we talked about, of being able to reapply again and again that main events recipe. So now if we rebuild the cache, go back to our upcoming events, now we see that calendar tab, and now we can do all of the fun things around dragging and drop to change the date, or to change when it's going to be, or even the duration. And if we click through, we can validate that those changes have all been saved to the database. Let's say we wanted to add events locations. So to be able to associate our events with different places. It's actually applying a different recipe as part of this called locations that sets up maps and a few other things. But now if we go ahead.
Clear cache.
Thank you. He's not just a pretty face. There we go. All right, clear the cache.
I'm not a pretty face. Thank you.
It's not just. Let's be fair. All right, so now we've got locations here. So we could do a similar thing and say, let's go ahead and add a location. I'm going to go ahead and put one in that I'm familiar with. State Street, save that. See that it sets up all of the maps out of the box using free geocoder. It's using Leaflet for mapping, so there's no API keys or anything like that required. And now if we go back to our events and go in to edit our test event, we can say, where's that going to be? Why, it's at the only location that we currently have in our database, which is convenient for us, but we can see it's listed there. And then the other thing that we can do, again, very quickly using a recipe. So let's go back to here and say events registration. Let's go ahead and rebuild our cache. And now when we go back in here, We won't see any visual difference right away. It's set a new default for new nodes, but for an existing node, we would have to go and say, use this registration type that the recipe has created for us called signup. And then when we save that now, we can see at the bottom, now users on the site have the ability to actually go ahead and register for this particular event. So this is using, the entity registration module, which means that the actual registration type is fieldable. So if as part of the registration you wanted to collect like t-shirt sizes or food allergies or whatever kinds of information are applicable to how registration needs to work on your site, it's all like fieldable, so super easy to set up. So those are just some like quick examples of using recipes. If there's time at the end, we can maybe even dig into a couple more, but maybe this is a good point to sort of jump back into our slideshow and sort of finish out the main part of the discussion.
So yeah, if you want to join the initiative, oh wait, I forgot my little clicker thing. Where did I put it? Yeah, could you? Thanks. Wait. If you want to get involved, of course, we already talked about documentation and recipe maintaining. Always contributions always welcomed here in the Drupal sphere. Developers and testers are wanted. We definitely need test coverage since this is going into core. We want your recipes as well. If you have a great sauce or something, please share it. I'm trying to create one for a hockey league and still failing at creating it. So, but if you have one and you have an idea like that, please feel free to share. There is the recipes channel in Slack. We do a twice a week or every other week kind of check-in meeting. It's asynchronous, so just go in there and you get Drupal credit for that as well. It's at 4 o'clock UTC. And then, of course, there's Contrib Day on Friday, which everybody should always go to while they're here in DrupalCon. We have also the Starshot work that's going on, or Drupal CMS work, where we're trying to create recipes for that. And we have all the different tracks that are going on. These are definitely something that the initiatives are wanting to resolve. So feel free to just hop in there and fix all the things. And of course, there's the QR code for this site on the Drupal CMS issues queue. Like I said, join us for the contribution day. There's mentored contribution on Friday. We have first-time contributor workshops later on today, and then, or no, that already happened. Great. But then general contribution always goes on throughout DrupalCons, so please feel free to help out wherever you can. And this is our wonderful survey QR code, so if you'd like to judge us, feel free to be judgy and all that great stuff. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, I don't know if any questions came through the app. Yeah, actually, we got one question on there, but also if you could approach the microphone if you have a question, that would be spiffy because that way it could be recorded. Oh, Leslie, I figured you'd just read it. Yeah.
Oh,
huh? What?
She said 6 or 7.
Okay, well, let's start off with Benji, and then we'll go with them.
Hi. So I wonder if a module maintainer can provide a sort of default recipe for their module. And so the use case I have in mind is, suppose that content workflows weren't in core, but it were contrib module, and I was maintaining it. And when people enable my module, I want to be able to add permissions to the core content editor role. So I could do that with a recipe. Can I distribute that recipe with my module?
So the simple answer, hopefully this is a simple answer, is you can provide a recipe for your module to sort of set it up in the way that you think is best practice, but it would have to be a separate project. So the recipe has to live as its own project. It has to be a general project on Drupal.org and can't contain any sort of PHP code. So the answer is yes, but they would have to be two separate. And what you could do is say, have your recipe require your module. And so basically on your project page, say, if you want to use this module and want help getting it set up, here's the recipe, apply that, and then you'll have everything you need to go.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
We have this pattern that we have modules that ship with configuration, some default config, and then also we have all these update hooks that want to update some content type definition and so on. And I see there is some overlap with the recipes, and also the recipes, there might also be this need to update stuff. So I don't know if there's gonna be some way to use recipes instead of update hooks, or update hooks to update recipes, or something like this. Because it seems maybe recipes with these plugins might be more elegant than an update hook.
So I totally agree, and I would say it would be lovely if at some point modules could make use of things like config actions, because as you say, it's much more elegant than having to write your own install hooks to perform some of the same kinds of things. But yeah, today those are separate concerns, so that's maybe something for the Drupal roadmap.
And the separation into separate project is because the discovery will not find the recipes if they are in a subdirectory, or?
Correct, yeah. So recipes have to be in their own directory, and certainly to be like discoverable from a composer standpoint, have to be like their own separate general project, or like externally hosted, as long as it's something that has like packaged integration.
So if there would be some trick to make symlinks into the module, but right now that doesn't happen, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, maybe there's, as you say, some hacky way to make that work, but best practice today would be
that is some voodoo cooking that.
right. All right, I think Leslie's got some questions.
These are from the chat.
Okay, great.
Can recipes distinguish between reapplying and modifying config owned, contributed by the recipe, and applying on the existing site with pre-existing node bundle, example event? That's a long one.
Yeah, once you use a recipe, it applies the default, the configuration of that recipe over and over again. So if you pull in a recipe, it's going to reapply it again and again, the exact same way. So if it's already something that's been modified, if the recipe doesn't have, if the recipe is trying to modify it, it will probably fail or not apply, right?
Yeah, and I think the other key point here is that the Drupal site itself can't distinguish between whether configuration has been applied via a recipe or through clicking around via Site Builder. Project Browser knows if you've applied a recipe through it, but otherwise the Drupal site itself has no idea that a recipe has been applied. It's basically the same end state as if you had clicked around.
We didn't talk about Project Browser at all, about how we're getting recipes in there as well.
We touched that, but yeah, anyway, there may be more questions on that.
All right, next question. Can recipes take user input?
Recipes do have a method today for user input. I don't know of any recipes myself that actually use that yet, but that capability is there. But I think it's also worth pointing out that I'm pretty sure that's in Drupal core, but not in any release yet. So coming in 11.1/10.4.
And that's where the wildcards and placeholders are looking. That's where we're looking to use them, but we don't have a use case really yet.
Okay, this is just someone's note. It says, just for your information on the topic of tooling, PHP Storm already understands the schema for recipe YAML file.
Very cool.
That's cool.
So that's an answer. Thank you, whoever gave that answer. Another one real quick. Can recipes, or will they be able to have options while installing them? Example, events recipe having a core set and then some extras based on choices that I make from a subscription form for my events.
So that's a great question. I would say by design today, recipes are not intending to use any kind of like a wizard style, step through choices sort of an idea. I think there is maybe a notion that in Project Browser, there might be a way to say, as we've talked about, I've applied the events recipe and here's some choices, but there's still like only preliminary discussion in terms of what form that might take. So.
Yeah, and if you're cooking and something adds for a teaspoon of salt, you don't put sugar in it. So, you follow the recipe as it is, basically.
Of course, that's how cooking works. You never deviate from the
science, man.
Well, hello. Thank you for the results. They look really cool. But my question is, how will a recipe affect a composer JSON, and at which point? You might have touched on it, and I might have not paid attention enough, but does a recipe change the composer JSON when you execute it or before, when you require the recipe?
So
We are
when you require it, it's going to pull in its dependencies and everything. So it's going to be just like a composer add or composer require, where it'll install, and then pretty much you'll see more in the lock itself, which is really the issue, because if you remove it, it's going to remove all those dependencies as well in the composer lock. So we're trying to figure out a way for it to.
That's where the unpacking comes in.
Correct. That's a whole unpacking thing.
All right, gotcha.
Great. I see we're at time. Maybe we can get in one quick one.
Yeah, I just had a crazy idea. So that a new way could be to, instead of requiring the recipe, you just get it from remote in a cache somewhere, and this requires you to already put all your dependencies in the composer JSON, because if you don't have them, the recipe won't work. And then you don't even get it anywhere, anytime in your own code base. It just stays in the remote place somewhere. And you just have a browser and you'd run it, and
That is putting faith that they're going to actually do that. So, I mean,
what I would say is, again, we've got that recipes channel in Drupal Slack, so by all means, hop in there and let's have that discussion and see if there's maybe something feasible in there to help us along the path of getting the unpacking going, because that's definitely where we want to get to.
So we have 5 or 6 more questions. We'll give them to the presenters, and they will answer them afterwards in the chat channel.
perfect.
Right on. Thanks, everyone.
Take care.